Welcome again to the Wednesday webinar. This is our 5th session with a focus on wine. And today we have Zach Mazur, who is the port specialist for Kobrand, my company, Kobrand Wine Spirits, for the Southeast US. And he represents our port brands, Croft, Fonseca, and Taylor Fladgate. And he's going to take you through what I think is often a misunderstood category, but these wines are fantastic and there's such a wide range. And so he's going to give you a little taste of that today. So with that, Zach, I'll let you take it from there. And if anyone has any questions, I'll be monitoring the chat box and we'll give you the password at the end of the session.
All right. Thanks again for coming out, and hopefully I can teach you guys a lot about port today. So without further ado, let's get it started. Well, it's important to note how and why port came to be. To understand that, we must take a look at the history of the country responsible for its development, and that, of course, would be England. The English fancied French wine for the longest time, especially their Bordeaux, but the supply of it was cut off when they were finally expelled from France toward the end of the 100 Years' War. That was in 1453 here. And it was during this war that the British traders had to turn to their ally to the south, the Portuguese, for their wine. So starting a little bit during that 100 Years' War, actually towards the beginning, merchants from Lisbon and Porto, actually, cities in Portugal, made an alliance with the King of England. That was in 1353, allowing the Portuguese to fish cod off of British shores in return for regular shipments of wine from Portugal. In time, the British wool merchants started trading cloth and corn for wine and olive oil, beginning one of the longest standing trade agreements in modern history. The wine at this time, though, was still table wine, not port as we know it today. Go a little bit further forward to 1662, and the English-Portuguese connection was further strengthened by the marriage of Charles II to Catherine of Braganza, which also helped to reinforce Portugal's sovereignty from Spain. So they have an important ally now in Portugal, and they have somewhere to get their wine from. But the problem is the wine at this time was still not very good. It was more of a thin, watery, think of like a Vino Verde type wine, and that did not hold up well to the travel between England and Portugal. So now about the late 1600s, early 1700s when things started to change. This was when it was around this time that British traders started establishing their own operations in Portugal so that they can control and improve the quality of the wine they were getting from there. And two of the port houses that I represent, or we represent here at Kobrand, were actually established in this era that were British families. That was Taylor Fladgate in 1692 and Croft even before that in 1588. So the 1703 Treaty of Methulen granted far lower duties on Portuguese wines than those being imported from other countries. And this was in response to the British discovering port as we know it today, a strong, sweet, and fortified wine with brandy, a grape spirit added to it, which helped it stand up to those rigors of sea travel. More on this process later, it's very important. But what is important to note here is that this is really the time when port started to take off with the insatiable sweet tooth of the British, demanding as much of it as they can get. But with any profitable and booming business, eventually there will be those trying to duplicate the original and pass it off as port from Portugal. And this led to a call for regulation of where the grapes can be grown. And in 1756, it was the Douro Valley in Portugal that was demarcated as the first demarcated wine region in the world. So the British really needed this to make sure that the quality of their wine coming in was always up to par. So they're able to get this the Douro Valley figured out as the only place where it should be coming from. All right, so that's the history part I have for you. But the most important thing to note from the history was that the port trade was built by the British for the British, and that's why at least half of the big port houses, if not more, still have a British name to this day, such as Taylor and Croft. But what is port? So port is a sweet and fortified wine, and you can actually make port anywhere and call it that, at least in the U.S. But true Porto with the O there can only be made in Portugal. And in the EU, they actually don't allow any port outside of Portugal to be called port or Porto. In the United States, though, we do have some domestically made ports, whether it's from California or New York, that are able to be called port. But the Porto shippers out of Portugal are actually working on getting that copyrighted, so they're not able to use it. It's the same thing with some brands. Some sparkling wines can still call themselves champagne, things like that in the U.S. Port has to be, true Porto has to be made from traditional Portuguese grapes, indigenous Portuguese grape varietals, and produced in Portugal's Douro Valley. All right, so here we have the Iberian Peninsula, the flag of Portugal. And then here kind of gives you an idea, circled up here, of the Douro River Valley. So it runs from through Spain into Portugal, and then the mouth of it is at this coastal city of Porto. That is the center of business and trade for port. And the Douro Valley is between there and the border with Spain. All right, so here is a picture of overlooking the port lodges. On the far side of the river, that's actually the city of Porto. And then the river, of course, that's the Douro River. And then on our side of the river is actually the sister city of Vila Nova de Gaia. And down there along the banks of the river is where a lot of the port lodges are. And then even up a couple blocks, that's where Taylor's Port Lodge is, right on the river. I think this picture looks like it was taken from, I believe it's taken from the Yateman Hotel. That's a hotel that's actually owned by the Taylor Flaggate Partnership. You can see their pool down here, and this is where the port is aged, in the city of Vila Nova de Gaia. All right, so another look at the Douro Valley as a wine region here in red. It is not the largest wine growing region in Portugal, but it's definitely the most famous and renowned. Here's a beautiful picture of the Douro Valley. Very steep slopes. You have to use terraced farming techniques to even be able to grow vines there. All right, so what is the climate like there? So the climate in the coastal city of Porto, right on the Atlantic, they have a cool, moderate maritime climate. So think kind of like a Seattle, Washington. But the climate in the Douro Valley, just east of there, on the other side of the Serra do Marão Mountains, is actually a lot different. They're in more of a rain shadow, and they have a continental climate. So it's very hot and dry in the summer, and they definitely reach freezing temperatures very often. It snows there in the winter, and they have a more moderate spring and fall. And then the further east you get out into the valley, up the Douro River, the drier it gets. And also the more extreme the temperature swings are, because they don't have that moderating influence of the Atlantic Ocean to keep the temperature moderate. And that's part of the reason why they age the port in the city of Porto, is because it's a very slow, gentle aging process, and the cool, humid area there, as compared to the hot, dry continental Douro. So in terms of soil, you only have to remember one thing. It's schist. That is the primary, that's really the only soil that's found there in the Douro Valley for growing quality grapevines. And it's important because it retains water very well, even in the driest months of the summer. And it cracks easily, allowing the vines to dig down really deep, up to maybe more even than up to 15 feet, to find water reserves in the driest months, so that the vines don't completely shut down. So it's very difficult to build. Actually, dynamite's required to carve out new terraces in the land. Okay, so here's the grapes. There's a lot more permitted varieties of this, but they all have to be indigenous red Portuguese grapes for making port. But these are the main 5 or 6. Touriga Franca, you might have heard of. That's going to be Touriga Franca and Touriga Nacional are probably going to be that's like the cabin, what Cabin Merlot is to Bordeaux. That is the main grapes for making port wine. But also Tinta Ruiz is very important. That's the same grape as Tempranillo. That's just called Tinta Ruiz in Portugal. And then Tinta Barroca, Tinta Amarela, and Tinta Cao are they're marked as the highest quality and usually making up the highest proportion of the blend. So there's the grapes. Harvest. So like we saw earlier in the picture, they're incredibly steep slopes that only permit hand harvesting. No large tractor equipment is able to get on these small terraces. Some bulk production and other wineries may use larger bins to collect their grapes, but at the Teller Flagate Partnership, the brands we represent, they only use these very small bins to keep the grapes intact, so they're not crushed before getting to the winemaking facility. So port production starts out really similar to the way most red wines are made: crush, ferment, press. But the big difference here is that it's a very rapid and intense fermentation process. It's only about 48 hours, and at that point, it is cut short when about half the sugar has been converted into alcohol. And the way that they arrest the fermentation is by adding 77% alcohol, pure grape spirit. They call it aguardiente. It's a brandy, and that kills the yeast, stopping the fermentation early and preserving the natural grape sugars in the wine. They also put enough in there to fortify the product up to 20% alcohol. So the wine is then transported by truck to Villanova de Gaia, where it is put in barrels for aging and further blending, and then eventually bottled. Back before they had tanker trucks, they would actually take the port by boat, by sailboat, down the Douro River. And at the time too, before the river was dammed up, it was a very dangerous journey because there's a lot of rapids. But people needed their port, so they figured out a way to get it done. So here's the different methods of fermentation that are used in production of port wines today. The first 3, auto fermenters, pump over fermenters, rotary fermenters, are more commonly used with bulk production, just your standard Ruby Tawny, maybe your Ruby Reserve as well. Those types of ports. And the last 2, the mechanized piston tanks, or what we call an adoption of this would be port toes. Get a little bit more into this later. And then actual foot treading, the traditional method, and stone lagars. These are reserved for only the highest quality ports, your 10, 20, 30 year, and your classic vintages. And actually, David Gimmeron, the winemaker at the Taylor Flagate Partnership, had a hand in developing the port toes, which are actually rubber feet that are attached to these piston tanks to almost 99% accurately replicate the foot treading that a human can do. He had part of that invention. So, but all of them, the idea here with all of these is that they need to extract as much color, tannin, flavor as possible, as quickly as possible, before too much sugar has fermented and the wine becomes too dry to make port. So here we're all talking about rapid extraction methods. Like I was saying, the traditional method, as you can see up top, foot treading, reserved for premium and vintage port. All of the classic vintage, LBV, and aged tawnies at the Taylor Flaggate Partnership are still foot treaded. And that is the Stone Lagar. It's a shallow, probably it's about 2 feet deep, 2 to 3 feet deep tub that enables this foot treading to be done. And then on the bottom here, it's the piston fermenters. Not a picture of the port toes. This is a little bit of a larger one, but it duplicates this process still pretty accurately. Okay, so here's a little bit of a better picture, close-up of foot treading. And this is what the first round looks like. It's very militaristic and controlled. And the reason it needs to be like that, and usually they have the younger, kind of like the younger, stronger people come in here, is because it's hard to break the grapes when they're still whole. So it really takes some work, and they gotta sit there for a couple hours and almost march in place and hold on to each other because they have to put all their weight on one foot and then the other foot to be able to get these grapes crushed, primarily crushed. But after that to do the rest of the crushing and to start this fermentation, everyone joins in and they have a really good time with it. There's dancing and singing involved, and it's a really long day because most of these people were out harvesting the grapes from sunrise to sunset, and then they get some dinner, come in here, and have to crush the grapes for another couple hours. So it's very hard work, but they get to enjoy it with this next stage of the foot treading. All right, so this is probably one of the most important slides, and this is one of the hardest things for people to understand about port. How do they fortify it? What happens and when? So fermentation is stopped at a halfway point by adding a clear, neutral grape spirit, aguardiente, like I was saying. And what we use at the Taylor Flaggate Partnership, at least, is we use high quality eau de vie, so a young cognac. And what they do here is you're fermenting about half the sugar in the grapes to alcohol. So at that point, you have a 7% alcohol, very sweet wine. And when they know they're at 7% alcohol or so, they're going to add the grape spirit, which kills the yeast, stops the fermentation, and fortifies the wine to 20% alcohol while preserving the natural grape sugars. The difference between this and, say, a regular dry red or white wine is that, say, like a Chardonnay or a Cabernet, you're taking about, say, 99% of the sugars in a Chardonnay or Cabernet grapes, and you're converting that. The yeast converts that to alcohol, and you're left with a 14% alcohol, dry, still wine. With port, on the other hand, same type of grapes that you're starting out with as, say, like a Cabernet or a Zinfandel, same type of sugar levels, maybe a little bit higher, but you're only fermenting half of them into alcohol, and that's where all the sweetness in port comes from. So all the sweetness in port is natural. The only thing being added here is a high-quality grape spirit. So how is this regulated? The Instituto dos Vinos do Douro y Porto, the IVDP, controls the release of ports to the market. So what does that mean? I think the most important thing that they do is when a port shipper decides to bottle and release a 10, 20, 30 year, 40-year tawny, the laws aren't very strict. That's an average age, but it can be a little bit less or a little bit more. But the IVDP board, what they do is they taste this, they analyze this, um, and they make sure that it is suitable to have that age statement on it, but before allowing it to go to market. They're also a little bit involved with making sure the port is high enough quality to be bottled as a vintage. But that's a little bit more of the port shipper's discretion. They won't submit something that's not going to be good enough to pass the IV DP. So the most important thing they do really is approving those aged tawnies. Also, the Casa do Douro regulates vineyards and Porto production in the Douro Valley. So vineyard classification in the Douro, the Beneficio system. What is important to know here about this is that is how the vineyards in the Douro Valley are rated for quality and production purposes. So whereas in Burgundy, France, you may have village level vineyards, grand and premier cru vineyards, here in the Douro Valley, they use the Beneficio system, which grades the vineyards from A to F based on both natural and man-made factors, with A having the highest rating and being allowed to produce the largest amount of yield uh, the largest amount of vines per area and the largest yields per vineyard, and F having the least. So that's what you need to remember about the Beneficio system. A to F, A is the top vineyards, F are the least, the lowest rated vineyards. In the bottom right here is a picture of the beautiful Quinta de Vargelis. That's Taylor Flagate's top vineyard, way out in the east end of the Douro Valley in the Douro Superiore. So like I was saying, the Douro Superiore on the east end, the right side, this is a zoomed in map of the Douro Valley. If you were to look off the screen to your left, out to the west, the Douro River empties into the coastal city of Porto. And as you go up the river, moving from left to right, you enter into the Baixo Corgo. So this is the coolest area, and it receives the most amount of rain. Most of the port that's produced here is going to be lower in quality, usually used more for cooking. Let me go back here. City of Lamego, that's where actually the strong, sweet, fortified port was first discovered by a monk. A monk there had a sweet tooth, and some British explorers were the first to find that modern type of port there, and that's how they figured out that you had to fortify it to keep it that way. And then here in the center, Pinhal is really the center city in the Cima, right in the middle of the Cima Corgo. That's where a lot of the top vineyards are located and where the vast majority of the production comes from, around Pinhal. But then there's also some really high quality, some of the best quality are actually in the Douro Superiore out here to the east. Okay, so I told you that fortification slide was the most important. This is probably just as important, or at worst second. This is the different types of port. So they all start the same way, but it's the size of the barrel or cask that they're aged in that determines the style. So really it's two main categories, ruby and tawny, but vintage is a completely different thing. Even though it's a ruby, it's made in a different way. So we're going to break it down into three types here, but remember, vintage is a ruby. So rubies are going to be aged in very large casks. We're talking 65,000 liters plus. and they're going to be ruby red to a deep purple in color, a lot more fruit forward on the nose and palate. Tawny Ports start the same way, but they go into small oak barrels. We're talking 600 liters, and they oxidize and become more brown, and they take on an increasingly oaky and nutty flavor and aroma the longer that they age in there. So 10, 20, 30 years. Vintage ports start out the same as your ruby ports, but instead of being bottled after they finish oak aging, or instead of being released right after they finish oak aging, they need time to age in the bottle, just like a fine Burgundy or fine Bordeaux. All the oak that these ports are aging is neutral. They've been used for the aging of other types of wine or spirits, and then they're seasoned with some low quality port to make sure there's no other flavors, and then these types of port go in them. But the main reason for the oak aging is to allow a controlled amount of oxygen to reach the port. So with the rubies, it's very little amount is able to reach the port, so they retain their color, flavor, and fruit. And then with the tawny, very small oak barrel, a lot more of the wine is in contact with the surface area of the oak, so a lot more oxygen is able to interact with the port and oxidize it, becoming more nutty and getting more of a caramel flavor. All right, so here's a look at what these big casks for the ruby ports look like. They can be up to 200,000 liters plus in some cases, but the most important thing is that they're very large, so not much oxygen exposure. And then on the bottom right here, this is small barrels. This is what your tawny ports are going to be aged in. So a lot more of the wine is in contact with oxygen. So your tawnies you do have what's called fine tawny that's just aged 2 to 4 years. You have tawny reserve, which need a minimum 6 years in barrel. But the most popular types are going to be what's called your age indicated tawnies. That's 10, 20, 30, and 40 years. There's also, and that's they're going to spend an average of that amount of time in oak casks. So part of the blend might be a little bit younger. Part of the blend's about 10 years. Part of the blend is a little bit older. There is vintage dated tawnies called Colheita, and that's going to be tawnies from a single harvest. They need to be at least 7 years old to be released. But the only one that we produce at Taylor Flaggate is a 50-year. So right now, the current release we have is a 1970. All the grapes were actually from 1970, and it's spent 50 years in barrel, aging in barrel before release, and then it was bottled ready to drink in 2020. So that's what a Colheita is. Ruby port, you do have fine ruby that's just aged a year or two in large oak vat. And then you have ruby reserve, which is a little bit higher quality, aged usually 2 to 3 years. Late bottled vintage, aged 4 to 6 years in large oak vat. And then bottled ready to drink, both of those. Vintage, only in declared years, which is about 3 times per decade, they have the right weather conditions to produce their best vintage ports. Those are bottled just for they spend just 2 winters in large oak vat, and then when they're declared, they're bottled and with a real cork, and they have to spend usually 10 plus years aging to reach maturity. Same thing with single quintas. They're made in the good years, not the best years, and they're usually from a single vineyard. So diving into it a little bit more, the ruby ports, like I was saying, ruby red to deep purple in color, a lot more fruit forward on the nose and palate, aged in large oak casks. Your vintage, single quinta, crusted, LBV, reserve, all fall under that category. Tawny, with that oak aging, they become more round and mellow with age. I say that they can even get these like a vanilla or almond extract type flavor and power when you get to that 30-year plus. The younger ones, a little more caramel, raisin, and nutty nuances. These are all aged, this again, aged in small oak barrels of around 600 liters. You have your 10, 20, 30, 40-year aged tawnies, and then single harvest tawnies from a single vintage year. Those are called colheitas in Portuguese. So vintage port. So this is the top of the top of the pyramid, the highest quality, and it establishes the house reputation and style. Taylor Fladgate, we have some examples here of Taylor Fladgate's classic vintages. They're known as being the finest producer of classic vintage port, only the highest quality. It's 2% of the total production. And the declaration is an individual house decision. So Taylor decides whether they want to declare a classic vintage, and this happens about 3 times per decade. And it's up to them whether they're going to bottle one or not. And this decision, like I said, it's say for the most recent declaration was 2019. So that's when the grapes are harvested, vinified, fortified, and then they go into barrel for 2 winters. And then actually the decision day comes on St. George's Day. So we just did this 2 or 3 weeks ago in April. Taylor didn't decide to declare the 2019 as a classic vintage, but they did bottle a single quinta. So they did bottle a 2019 Taylor Vargelis single quinta, and so they put that into bottle under cork, and they're actually deciding they're going to hold that for 10 years before release, so that it's ready to drink upon release. So non-classic vintage ports, these are usually going to be frequently single quinta ports, but sometimes they can be a blend of single quintas, such as Fonseca's Guimarães port. That's a blend of Fonseca's top couple quintas. Croft makes a Rueda that's always just from their top vineyard Rueda, and then Taylor Fladgate makes Vargelis from their top quinta. It's the Portuguese word for farm, so that's from their single vineyards, and these age under real cork in the bottle as well. Okay, so late bottle vintage port, this can get a little bit confusing. This is a Ruby Reserve style of port introduced by Taylor Fladgate in 1970. So we just, with the 1965 being their first vintage, because it spent 5 years aging in barrel before release. Single harvest wood aged port. So what that means is they're trying to replicate the style of a young vintage port that's spent several years aging in cork in the bottle by aging it instead in oak for several years. So these are very high quality ports. In a non-vintage declared years, it's actually the best quality that we're producing goes into these, but they're very affordable and they're bottled ready to drink. You don't have to wait for them to develop under cork in the bottle. So reserve ports. This is the one step above your basic rubies is your reserves. And these are a non-vintage blend. So think you have a Brut champagne that's non-vintage, is a blend of a couple different vintages. And that also reflects the house style. It's the same thing here with your ruby reserves, produced to maintain a consistent style year over year. Fonseca Bin 27, Croft Distinction are some examples. Graham's 6 grapes, Sandeman's Founders Reserves. Those are all examples of reserve ports, usually aged 2 to 4 years, large oak vat, and then they're bottled ready to drink. So Tawny Ports, rich, smooth, nutty, caramel flavors, normally produced an average of 10, 20, 30 years. We already went over what a Colliette is. Taylor 20-year is actually the #1 selling Tawny Port in the U.S. It's very popular here. Fonseca makes a really great one as well. So serving and storing ports, especially here in Florida when it's summer pretty much year round, it's really nice to have port lightly chilled. So I'd say around 62 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit is where you want to have these. So kind of how you'd store your light-bodied red wines like Pinot Noir, that's going to be the perfect serving temperature for ports. Much older vintage ports that have been aged under cork for a long time, those only last for a day after opening, because as soon as they get decanted, without being exposed to oxygen for so long, once that they start interacting with that oxygen, they're gonna go flat really quick, just like an old Burgundy or Bordeaux still wine. But but a young vintage port should last a few days. Anything that has less than 10, 15 years on it should last a few days after opening. But all the other types of ports, all your Ruby Reserves, Fine Ruby, Fine Tawny, LBV, they're going to last for a month or two at peak freshness after opening. All right, port pairings. So of course, all wine pairs well with cheese, but port in particular does really well. And then I would say the best pairings for Ruby port, which is going to be more sweet, and more fruit forward on the nose and palate. It's going to go really well with things that have fruits in them. And then I like to pair it with dark chocolate also. And then Tawny ports, which are more oaky, nutty, has that caramel flavor. Those are going to go really well with your creme brulee, anything with the burnt sugars, flan, nuts, things like that. So the pairings are really endless, and any dessert can be properly paired with a port, or anything that you'd put on a charcuterie board, even as an aperitif, can go really well with a port also. So port also has some great, port can also be used in mixology, because you have a really high quality product that, let me go back here. So the port and mixology, you have a really high quality product that's going to be, that you can add flavor, color, and complexity to a lot of different beverages. If you're interested in that, at www.portcocktails.com, that can, that has a lot of great cocktail recipes that were made by the Taylor Flaggate Partnership. Portcocktails.com. And that is what I have for you.
Awesome. If you'll leave that slide up just for a minute so that everyone can get the link. And the link is also in the chat box. And I've just posted the password in the chat box. It is Ruby with a capital R. Ruby, R-U-B-Y with a capital R. Thank you, Zach. That was fantastic. A lot of information, good detail, and I hope everyone has a better understanding of the different categories and styles of port. I am a big fan of port cocktails. I think that port is a tremendous mixing ingredient in cocktails, and I know that so many people are enjoying lower alcohol beverage cocktails these days, and using wine as an ingredient as opposed to other higher proof spirits achieves that. So I think it's great. Does anybody have any questions for Zach? You can unmute yourself or write in the chat box, either one. I
guess we were pretty thorough there. That was a pretty thorough presentation of port. A lot of information to retain, but I'm sure everyone will get a copy to look over. And after sitting through this, everyone's a port expert.
That's right. And we know that port is important. Get it? We use that at Kobrand all the time. Zach, much like the other presenters that you have seen over the last month or two, is available to do events at your clubs for your members or for your club staff, and he can help you in your studies for those of you that are studying for some exams, as well as myself and Steve Millickman and Rochelle, who's on the call today as well. So once again, thank you all very much for your time and your attention, and I hope you're enjoying these. We have one left to go next week. We'll be talking about California. And if there's something that you'd like to see in the future, we might be able to talk to Beth and get on your schedule again for the future. So be sure to share your thoughts and your input. If there's anything we can do to improve, share that with her as well. We'd love to hear your feedback. And thank you all once again. Again, the password is Ruby with a capital R. R-U-B-Y. Ruby, like Ruby Port. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a good one.
Thank you.